The gunshot cracked through the narrow alley before Elena Cross even understood what was happening. One moment she was hurrying home from her late shift at the flower shop, and the next, she was pressed against a cold brick wall, with her heart slamming against her ribs. A man in a dark coat had grabbed her arm only seconds earlier, dragging her off the main street, muttering something about a debt she had never heard of, and a name that meant nothing to her. She had no idea she had been mistaken for someone else. All she knew was fear, sharp and immediate, closing around her throat. Then, out of nowhere, a second man appeared. He moved like he owned the darkness itself, calm and unhurried, as if chaos simply rearranged itself around him. He said nothing dramatic. He didn't shout. He simply looked at the man holding Elena, and something in that look made the attacker's grip loosen instantly. Within seconds, the stranger had pulled her free and put himself between her and the danger. Elena stumbled back, gasping, staring at the man who had just saved her life. He was tall, dressed in a black coat that looked far too expensive for a back alley, with sharp eyes that studied her like he was solving a puzzle. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He didn't offer comfort. He simply said one sentence: "You shouldn't be out here alone at this hour." Then he turned to leave, as if saving her life was nothing more than an inconvenience he needed to correct before moving on with his night. "Wait," Elena called after him, her voice shakier than she wanted it to be. "Who are you? What was that? Why did that man grab me?" He paused, glancing back at her over his shoulder. "Wrong place, wrong time. Go home, Miss Cross." Her breath caught. "How do you know my name?" He didn't answer. He simply disappeared into the shadows of the city, leaving her standing there, shaken and confused, with more questions than she had ever expected to carry home with her that night. What Elena didn't know was that the man who had just saved her was Damien Voss, the head of one of the most feared crime families in the city. Damien didn't rescue strangers. He didn't involve himself in random street trouble that had nothing to do with his business. But something about the panic in her eyes when he turned the corner had made him act before he could stop himself. It was reckless. It was unlike him, and it bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He walked 3 blocks before he allowed himself to think about it clearly. The man who had grabbed her worked for a small-time debt collector who had nothing to do with Damien's organization, which meant Elena Cross had simply been unlucky, mistaken for someone else in a case of terrible timing. It should have ended there. He should have forgotten her the moment he stepped back into his car. Instead, her face stayed with him the entire ride home. Not because she was beautiful, although she was. It was the way she had looked at him. Not with fear. Not once she realized he wasn't a threat. She had looked at him with curiosity, like she was trying to understand him, rather than run from him. Nobody looked at Damien Voss like that. People feared him, respected him, obeyed him. Nobody was ever simply curious. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself the moment was already behind him. He was wrong. The next morning, Damien sat in his office on the top floor of a building that most of the city believed was nothing more than a private investment firm. His right-hand man, Nathan Bellamy, stood across from him, with a folder in his hand, reading through the numbers from the previous night's operations. Damien wasn't listening. His mind kept drifting back to the alley, to the woman with the paint-stained fingers who ran a flower shop 3 streets from where she'd been grabbed. "You're distracted," Nathan said, not looking up from the folder. "I'm not," Damien replied, too quickly. Nathan finally lifted his eyes. He had worked beside Damien for over a decade, long enough to recognize every shift in his mood, every flicker of something unusual. "You've checked your phone 4 times in the last 10 minutes. You never do that." Damien didn't respond. Instead, he stood and walked toward the window, staring down at the city below, at the maze of streets that hid 1,000 secrets, one of which now included a florist who had no idea what world she had brushed against. "Just find out who she is," Damien said finally, his voice low. "The woman from last night. I want to know if she's safe. That's all." Nathan raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. In their world, everything had a purpose, and pulling information on a random civilian without a clear reason was unusual behavior from a man who valued control above everything else. But Nathan had learned long ago not to question Damien when his tone shifted like that. By the afternoon, Nathan returned with a short report. Elena Cross, 26 years old, owned a small flower shop passed down from her grandmother. No family in the crime world, no dangerous connections, No debts, no secrets worth hiding. She was, in every sense, exactly who she appeared to be. Ordinary, safe, untouched by the darkness that surrounded Damien's entire existence. He should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt something closer to disappointment, though he couldn't explain why. That evening, without fully deciding to do it, Damien found himself parked across the street from her flower shop. He told himself he was simply making sure the danger from the previous night hadn't followed her home. He told himself this was a security check, nothing more. But when the shop lights dimmed and Elena stepped out, locking the door behind her, wrapping a scarf around her neck against the evening chill, he felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. She didn't notice him. She walked toward the bus stop, humming quietly to herself, completely unaware that the most dangerous man in the city was watching her from the shadows, just as unable to look away as he had been the night before. Days passed, and Damien told himself each time would be the last. He would check once more, then let it go, but once became twice, and twice became a habit he refused to name. He learned her schedule without meaning to memorize it. He knew she opened her shop at 8, that she always stopped at the small bakery 2 doors down for a coffee, that she waved at almost everyone she passed like the city hadn't taught her to be suspicious of strangers the way it had taught him. Elena, for her part, began to notice things too. A black car that seemed to appear more often than coincidence should allow. A feeling, faint but persistent, that she was being watched. She wasn't naive, and she wasn't willing to simply ignore it. One evening, after closing her shop, she spotted the same car parked in its usual spot. Instead of walking to the bus stop as she always did, she crossed the street directly toward it, her heart pounding but her steps steady. She had spent her whole life being told to avoid danger, but curiosity, and perhaps something else she didn't want to name yet, pulled her forward instead. Damien saw her coming and, for the first time in longer than he could remember, felt something close to nervousness. He rolled down the window as she approached, his expression carefully unreadable. "You've been following me," Elena said, arms crossed, voice steady despite the way her pulse raced. "I've been making sure you're safe," Damien replied evenly. "That's the same thing." "It isn't." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the answers he clearly wasn't going to give freely. "Why would a stranger care whether I'm safe? You saved me once. That should have been enough. Why are you still here?" Damien didn't have an answer that made sense, not one he was willing to say out loud. He looked at her, at the mixture of fear and defiance in her eyes, and realized that whatever this was, it had already gone further than he ever intended. "Get in the car," he said quietly. "I'll explain what I can." Elena hesitated only a moment before opening the door and stepping inside, unaware that this single decision would change the course of both their lives forever. Neither of them spoke as the car pulled away from the curb, the city lights sliding past the windows like a warning neither of them chose to hear. For Damien, this was the moment he should have walked away for good. Instead, it was the moment he stopped trying to forget her at all. Inside the car, the silence stretched long enough that Elena almost changed her mind and reached for the door handle. But before she could, Damien finally spoke, his voice low and controlled, the voice of a man used to choosing his words carefully, because he understood how much weight they carried. "My name is Damien Voss," he said. "I run a company that most people believe is simply an investment firm. It isn't. I lead an organization that deals in things I won't pretend are innocent. The man who grabbed you that night worked for someone connected to my world, though not directly to me. You were never his target. You were simply unlucky." Elena stared at him, processing the words slowly, piecing together what he wasn't saying as much as what he was. "You're telling me you're some kind of criminal. I'm telling you the truth, because you deserve to know why a stranger has been checking on you for days," Damien said. "I don't expect you to understand it. I barely understand it myself." Elena should have been terrified. Every instinct told her she should ask him to stop the car immediately and never look back. But there was something in the honesty of his voice, something in the way he admitted his own confusion, that kept her from reaching for the door. "Why did you save me that night?" she asked instead. "If it wasn't your responsibility, if it had nothing to do with you, why did you step in at all?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the passing streets rather than at her. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I've spent my whole life making decisions based on strategy. Not instinct. That night I didn't think. I just moved. It's not something that happens to me. Elena studied his profile. The sharp line of his jaw. The tension in his shoulders that never seemed to fully relax. And now? Why keep watching me instead of walking away like you should have? Because I can't seem to stop, he said quietly, and the honesty in his voice surprised even him. The car pulled to a stop outside her apartment building, and for a moment neither of them moved. Elena's hand rested on the door handle, but she didn't open it right away. "This is dangerous, isn't it?" she asked. "Whatever this is." "Yes," Damien said without hesitation. "More dangerous than you can imagine. You should walk away and forget you ever met me." Elena almost smiled, though there was no humor in it. "You could have let that stranger take me and never think about it again. Instead, you're sitting here warning me to stay away from you. That doesn't sound like the kind of man people describe when they whisper your name." "People don't know me," Damien said. "They know what I've built. That isn't the same thing." Elena finally opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air, but she paused before closing it, looking back at him one last time. "Good night, Damien Voss." He watched her walk into the building, telling himself this would be the end of it. He had given her the truth. He had given her every reason to run. If she had any sense, she would never speak to him again. She didn't run. 3 days later, Elena found herself standing outside the entrance to a private restaurant she had never heard of, wearing a coat that suddenly felt too plain for a place that clearly catered to people with more money than she would earn in a decade. Damien had sent a message, brief and direct, asking her to meet him for dinner. She had told herself she would say no. Instead, she found herself walking through the door exactly on time. Damien rose from his seat when she arrived, an old-fashioned gesture that felt strange coming from a man who controlled an empire built on fear. They sat across from each other, and for the first hour, the conversation was careful, testing the boundaries of what could be said between two people from such different worlds. Elena learned that Damien had inherited his position at a young age, following the death of his father, forced into a life he never fully chose but had learned to master out of necessity. Damien learned that Elena's flower shop had been her grandmother's dream, something she had promised to protect long before she understood how much sacrifice that promise would require. "You don't ask the questions I expect," Damien said at one point, watching her closely. "What questions do you expect? How many people I've hurt? What crimes I've committed? Whether I feel guilty?" Elena considered this for a moment. "Would you answer honestly if I asked?" "Probably not entirely," Damien admitted. "Then there's no point asking," she said simply. "I'd rather understand who you are, through what you do now, not through a list of things you'd only half explain anyway." Damien found himself unsettled by how easily she saw through him, how she managed to sidestep his usual defenses without even trying. Nobody spoke to him this way. Nobody dared to be this unguarded in his presence. Over the following weeks, their meetings became more frequent, though never public, never obvious. Damien was careful, always aware of the danger his world could bring to someone as unprotected as Elena. He kept their meetings quiet, choosing private places, avoiding anything that could draw unwanted attention. But despite his caution, his men began to notice the change in him. Nathan was the first to say it out loud. "You're rerouting patrols near her street. You've assigned extra security to that entire block without telling anyone why. This isn't protection anymore, Damien. This is something else." "It's necessary," Damien said, though even he could hear how thin the excuse sounded. "Necessary for what?" Nathan pressed. "She's not connected to any of our business. She's not a target. She's not an asset. So what exactly are we protecting?" Damien didn't answer, because the truth was becoming harder to deny with every passing day. He wasn't protecting a stranger anymore. He was protecting someone who had become important to him in a way he had never allowed anyone to become important before. Elena, meanwhile, was fighting her own quiet battle. Her friends noticed the change in her too, the late nights she wouldn't explain, the small smile that appeared whenever her phone buzzed with a message she wouldn't share. Her closest friend, a woman named Grace who worked at the bakery near her shop, finally confronted her about it over coffee one morning. "You've been different lately," Grace said, studying Elena carefully. "Distracted. Happy, but distracted. Who is he?" Elena hesitated, unsure how much she could say without revealing the truth she barely understood herself. "It's complicated." It's always complicated, Grace said with a small laugh. But you look at your phone like it might disappear if you blink too slowly. That's not complicated. That's something real. Elena didn't deny it, because she couldn't. Somewhere between the fear of that first night and the quiet dinners that followed, something had shifted inside her that she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she was ready to name. One evening, weeks into their careful, secretive connection, Damien arrived at her shop just as she was closing for the night. He stood in the doorway, watching her arrange the last of the flowers into their buckets, and for a moment, he simply allowed himself to observe her without speaking, without the weight of his usual guarded expression. "You're staring," Elena said without looking up. "I'm thinking," Damien replied. "About what?" "About how someone like you exists in a city that usually only shows me its worst side." Elena finally looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "Maybe the city isn't as dark as you've convinced yourself it is. Maybe you've just been looking in the wrong places." Damien crossed the small shop, stopping close enough that the space between them felt charged with something neither of them had said aloud yet. "I've spent my entire life building walls, Elena. I don't know how to exist without them. And yet somehow, you've found ways through every single one." "Maybe I'm not trying to knock them down," Elena said softly. "Maybe I just don't see the point of walls when I'm standing right in front of you." The moment stretched between them, fragile and honest, until Damien finally reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, a gesture so careful it seemed at odds with everything the world believed about him. "This isn't safe," he said quietly. "Being close to me isn't safe." "I know," Elena whispered. "I should walk away and never come back." "You keep saying that," Elena said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "And yet here you are, every single time." Damien didn't have an answer for that, because she was right. He had told himself countless times that this needed to end, that involving her further would only bring danger into her carefully ordinary life. And yet every time he tried to stay away, he found himself back at her door within days, unable to fully commit to the distance he knew was necessary. What neither of them realized that night was that their careful secrecy had already begun to crack. Somewhere across the city, eyes that did not belong to Damien's organization had already noticed the pattern. The black car parked too often near an ordinary flower shop, the unusual security assigned to a street that held no strategic value to the Voss family's usual operations. The Marchetti family, longtime rivals of the Voss empire, had spent years searching for a weakness in Damien's carefully guarded life. He had always been untouchable, a man who kept his personal world so tightly controlled that no leverage could ever be found against him. But a flower shop, a young woman with no protection of her own, and a mafia boss who seemed unable to stay away, presented exactly the kind of vulnerability they had been waiting for. Victor Marchetti, the head of the rival family, received the report from one of his informants with a slow, satisfied smile. For years, he had watched Damien Voss expand his influence without a single crack in his defenses. Now, finally, there was a crack, small but real, and Victor intended to widen it until it broke Damien completely. "Find out everything about her," Victor instructed his men. "Where she lives, where she works, who she loves. If Damien Voss has finally found something he cares about, then we've finally found the key to bringing him down." Neither Damien nor Elena knew, as they stood together in the quiet flower shop that evening, that their careful secret had already become someone else's opportunity. The walls Damien had spent his life building were beginning to crumble, not because he had chosen to let them fall, but because love, once it took root, proved far harder to control than any empire he had ever commanded. And somewhere in the shadows of the city, danger was already beginning to move. Victor Marchetti did not believe in rushing important plans. He had built his family's power slowly, patiently, waiting years for the right opportunity to strike at his greatest rival. Now that opportunity had finally appeared in the form of a young woman who ran a flower shop and had no idea what kind of danger her quiet life had suddenly attracted. For 2 weeks, Victor's men watched from a careful distance, documenting Elena's routine with the same precision Damien's own people once used to track threats. They noted the times she opened her shop, the friends she spoke with, the evenings Damien's car appeared outside her building. Every detail became a piece of a plan that Victor intended to execute with devastating precision. Damien, meanwhile, remained unaware of how closely he was being watched. He had grown so focused on protecting Elena from the general dangers of his world that he failed to consider the possibility that his enemies had already noticed his change in behavior. It was Nathan who first raised the alarm, arriving at Damien's office with a tension in his posture that immediately caught Damien's attention. "We have a problem," Nathan said, closing the door behind him. "One of our informants inside the Marchetti network reached out this morning. They know about her, Damien. They know about Elena." The color seemed to drain from Damien's face, though his expression remained carefully controlled, decades of discipline keeping his composure intact, even as fear settled deep in his chest for the first time in years. "How much do they know?" "Enough," Nathan said grimly. "Her name, her shop, her schedule. They've been watching her for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. Victor Marchetti isn't the kind of man who gathers information without intending to use it." Damien stood abruptly, walking to the window, staring down at the city that suddenly felt far more dangerous than it had that morning. Every instinct he had built over years of leading his organization screamed at him to act immediately, to eliminate the threat before it could grow any further. But beneath that instinct was something new, something he had never had to consider before. Fear not for himself, but for someone else entirely. "We increase her security immediately," Damien said, turning back to Nathan. "Discreet, but constant. I want eyes on her at all times, day and night." "That will only confirm to Victor that she matters to you," Nathan warned. "The moment he sees a full security detail around an ordinary woman, he'll know exactly how valuable she's become. If we increase protection too visibly, we hand him the very leverage he's hoping to find." Damien understood the logic, but every part of him resisted the alternative. "Then what do you suggest?" "Distance," Nathan said simply. "Cut ties with her, publicly and completely. Make it clear to anyone watching that she means nothing to you. It's the only way to remove her as a target." The suggestion settled over Damien like a weight he didn't know how to carry. He had spent weeks trying to convince himself he could protect Elena without pulling her fully into his world. Now, faced with the reality of what his closeness had already cost her safety, he understood that protecting her might require the one thing he had been unwilling to consider: letting her go completely. That evening, Damien arrived at Elena's shop with a heaviness in his chest that felt unfamiliar and unwelcome. Elena looked up from the counter, her smile fading the moment she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. Damien took a slow breath, forcing himself to say words he didn't believe, but knew he needed to speak. "This needs to end, Elena. Whatever this has become between us, it can't continue." Elena's expression shifted from confusion to something more guarded. "Where is this coming from? 2 days ago you were standing in this exact spot telling me you couldn't stay away." "I was wrong," Damien said, forcing his voice to remain flat, controlled, even as every word felt like it cost him something he couldn't afford to lose. "You deserve a normal life. You deserve safety. I can't give you either of those things, and I was foolish to pretend otherwise." "That's not an answer," Elena said, stepping closer, refusing to accept the distance he was trying to create. "Something happened. Tell me what it is." Damien hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect her through honesty and the strategy that demanded complete separation. In the end, he chose the version of the truth he believed would keep her safest, even if it meant lying about the depth of what he felt. "Nothing happened," he said. "I simply realized this was never going to work. You belong in a world I can't be part of, and I belong in one you shouldn't have to touch. It's better this way." Elena studied him for a long moment, and for the first time since they had met, Damien saw something in her eyes that looked like real hurt rather than fear or curiosity. "If that's really what you believe," she said quietly, "then I won't try to convince you otherwise." She turned back to her flowers, and Damien forced himself to walk away, every step feeling like a betrayal of everything he had begun to feel over the past weeks. He told himself this was necessary, that distance was the only way to keep her safe from a danger she didn't even know existed. But walking away from her felt like tearing something loose inside his chest that he wasn't sure could ever be repaired. Elena spent the following days trying to convince herself that Damien's sudden coldness didn't matter, that she had known from the beginning this connection was reckless and doomed. She threw herself into her work, arranging flowers with more focus than usual, avoiding her phone whenever it buzzed in case it wasn't him, and equally avoiding it in case it was. Grace noticed the shift immediately. "You look like someone took the light out of the room," she said one afternoon. watching Elena arrange a bouquet with unusual precision. Did something happen with him? It's over, Elena said simply, not looking up from the flowers. It was never going to last anyway. I was foolish to think otherwise. Doesn't sound like you believe that, Grace said gently. Elena didn't answer, because she didn't fully believe it either, but she had no way of knowing that Damien's sudden distance wasn't a change of heart, but an attempt at protection, a desperate move to keep danger away from a life she had built with such care. While Elena focused on convincing herself to move forward, Victor Marchetti was watching the situation unfold with growing frustration. He had expected Damien's sudden distance to be a trick, a strategic move meant to protect his true feelings from exposure. Victor's informants confirmed that Damien's visits to the flower shop had stopped entirely, that the black car no longer appeared on her street, that all visible connection between them had vanished within days. He's trying to protect her, Victor said to his second-in-command, a sharp-eyed man named Daniel Reyes, which means she matters more than we initially believed. A man like Damien Voss doesn't simply walk away from something that means nothing to him. Do we move forward with the plan? Daniel asked. Victor considered this carefully. Damien's distance had made a direct approach more difficult, but it hadn't erased the truth Victor now understood clearly. Elena Cross was the first crack Damien had ever allowed to exist in his carefully guarded world. Whether Damien admitted his feelings or not, the vulnerability remained. We wait, Victor said finally. Damien believes distance will protect her. Let him believe that a little longer. When he's convinced she's safe, when his guard drops even slightly, that's when we move. Patience has always served us better than urgency. Weeks passed in this uneasy silence. Damien threw himself into his work with a ferocity that concerned even Nathan, using the demands of his organization to distract himself from thoughts of Elena that refused to fade no matter how hard he tried to suppress them. He told himself the distance was working, that keeping her out of his life meant keeping her safe from a danger she would never need to know about. Elena, meanwhile, slowly began to rebuild the rhythm of her ordinary life, though something about it now felt hollow in a way she couldn't quite explain. She continued running her shop, continued spending evenings with Grace, continued moving through her days with the same routines she had followed long before Damien Voss had ever entered her world. But every so often, in quiet moments, she found herself glancing toward the street outside her shop, half expecting to see a familiar black car that never appeared. It was during this fragile calm that Victor Marchetti finally decided the moment had come. He had watched long enough, waited patiently enough, and now believed the distance between Damien and Elena had lulled everyone into a false sense of security. It was time to test exactly how much Elena Cross truly meant to the man who had tried so hard to convince the world she meant nothing at all. Late one evening, as Elena closed her shop and began her familiar walk toward the bus stop, unfamiliar figures emerged from the shadows with a coordination that left no room for escape. She barely had time to register what was happening before she was pulled into a waiting vehicle, her protest swallowed by the noise of the city around her, no one nearby aware that anything unusual had occurred at all. By the time Nathan received the frantic call from one of the security team members Damien had quietly kept assigned to watch over her despite his public distance, Elena Cross had already disappeared into the depths of Victor Marchetti's world, and the fragile peace Damien had tried so desperately to create had shattered completely. Damien received the news standing in his office, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the controlled, calculating mafia boss the world feared disappeared entirely, replaced by a man consumed by a single, desperate need to bring back the one person he had convinced himself he could live without. He had failed to forget her before danger ever arrived. Now, with her life hanging in the balance, forgetting her was no longer even a thought worth considering. All that mattered now was finding her, and making certain that whoever had taken her would learn exactly what it meant to threaten something Damien Voss had finally allowed himself to love. Nathan had never seen Damien move with such raw urgency. The calculated, controlled leader who weighed every decision with careful precision was gone, replaced by a man driven entirely by instinct and fear. Within minutes of learning that Elena had disappeared, Damien had every available resource in his organization mobilized, phones ringing across the city, informants pressed for answers, security footage pulled from every camera near her shop. We need to think clearly, Nathan said, trying to steady the room even as his own concern was evident. If this is Victor, and everything points to him, Then charging in without a plan will only put her in greater danger. I don't care about strategy right now, Damien said, his voice sharper than Nathan had ever heard it. I care about getting her back. And I care about making sure she comes back alive, Nathan shot back, forcing Damien to meet his eyes. Victor didn't take her to hurt her immediately. He took her because she's leverage. That means we have time, but only if we use it wisely, instead of walking into whatever trap he's prepared for you. Damien forced himself to breathe, forced the years of discipline he had built to override the panic threatening to consume him entirely. Nathan was right, and both of them knew it. Victor Marchetti hadn't spent years waiting for an opportunity, only to waste it through carelessness. This was a calculated move, designed to draw Damien out, to force him into a position where his enemy held every advantage. Find out where she is, Damien said finally, his voice regaining some of its usual control. I want every informant, every contact, every resource we have searching immediately, and when we find her, we do this carefully. No mistakes. Across the city, Elena sat in a dimly lit room, her wrists bound loosely enough to avoid injury, but tightly enough to prevent escape. She had been terrified in the first moments after being taken, but as the hours passed, her fear slowly transformed into something closer to determination. She studied her surroundings carefully, noting details she hoped might matter later, the layout of the room, the voices she overheard outside the door, anything that might help if an opportunity for escape ever presented itself. Victor entered the room eventually, studying her with the same calculating expression he used when evaluating any potential advantage. You seem calmer than I expected, he said. Panicking won't help me, Elena replied, her voice steadier than she felt. I assume you didn't take me because you actually want anything from me directly. This is about Damien. Victor's lips curved into a thin smile. Clever. Yes, this is about Damien Voss, though I suspect you already understood that the moment you were taken. He spent years building an empire without a single vulnerability. Then he found you, and suddenly, for the first time, he has something to lose. If you're trying to hurt him through me, you should know he already tried to protect me by staying away, Elena said. As far as anyone watching could see, we ended things weeks ago. An interesting attempt, Victor said, but not entirely convincing. A man doesn't quietly reassign security details to protect someone who means nothing to him. Damien's distance was a strategy, not truth. And strategies, Miss Cross, tend to reveal exactly what they're trying to hide. Elena said nothing further, unwilling to give Victor any additional information that might strengthen whatever plan he had already set into motion. But inside, a quiet hope began to grow, not because she was certain Damien would come for her, but because some part of her, despite everything, still believed he might. Back within his own territory, Damien worked through the night with an intensity that left even his most experienced men struggling to keep pace. Information slowly began to surface, fragments gathered from informants who owed Damien favors, from contacts within Victor's own organization who valued self-preservation over loyalty. By early morning, Damien had a location, an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city that Victor's family had used for years to conduct business away from public attention. This could be a trap, Nathan warned, studying the information laid out before them. Victor knows you'll come. He's had time to prepare for exactly this moment. I know, Damien said quietly, but staying here and waiting isn't an option. Nathan studied his friend for a long moment, recognizing something in Damien's expression that he had rarely seen before. Not the calculated confidence of a man who controlled every situation, but the raw determination of someone willing to risk everything for a single outcome. Then we go in smart, Nathan said finally. Not reckless. If we're doing this, we do it in a way that gives her the best possible chance. The plan they assembled over the following hours was careful and precise, drawing on years of experience navigating dangerous situations, though nothing in either man's history had prepared them for the weight of what was actually at stake this time. Every decision carried more consequence than usual. Every risk measured not just against strategy, but against the fear of losing someone neither of them was willing to imagine losing. As evening fell, Damien's people moved into position around the warehouse, communication carefully coordinated, every step calculated to minimize danger, while maximizing the chance of a successful outcome. Damien himself moved toward the building with a controlled calm that masked the storm raging beneath his composed exterior. Inside, Elena had spent the day trying to gather any information she could, listening carefully to the conversations happening beyond her locked door. She had learned that Victor expected Damien to arrive that evening, that preparations had been made throughout the building to ensure any attempt at rescue would be met with significant resistance. The knowledge did little to calm her nerves, but it gave her something to focus on beyond simply waiting helplessly. When the moment finally arrived, it happened faster than Elena expected. The quiet of the warehouse shattered as Damien's people moved in with practiced coordination, creating enough disruption to draw attention away from the room where Elena was being held. Within minutes, the door to her room opened, and instead of one of Victor's men, she found herself looking directly into Damien's eyes for the first time in weeks. Relief flooded through her so completely that for a moment she couldn't speak at all. Damien crossed the room quickly, working to free her bindings with hands that, despite the chaos surrounding them, moved with careful gentleness. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "I'm fine," Elena said, though her voice trembled slightly. "You came." "Of course I came," Damien said, meeting her eyes with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "I should never have let you believe otherwise. I was trying to protect you by pushing you away, and instead, I nearly lost you completely. That was the greatest mistake I've ever made." Before Elena could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps outside the door reminded them both that they weren't safe yet. Damien pulled her carefully behind him, positioning himself between her and the doorway as voices grew louder in the hallway beyond. "We need to move now," he said quietly, guiding her toward a side exit his team had identified during their planning. "Stay close to me, and don't stop moving no matter what happens." The escape through the warehouse was tense, every corner holding the possibility of confrontation, every sound amplified by the fear neither of them voiced aloud. Damien's people worked to create distractions, drawing Victor's attention toward false points of exit, while the real path to safety remained hidden. Elena stayed close beside Damien, trusting him completely despite the danger surrounding them, her earlier fear replaced by a fierce determination to make it through this together. They reached the outer edge of the warehouse just as Victor himself emerged from a side corridor, flanked by several of his own men, his earlier calm now replaced by visible frustration at how quickly his plan had unraveled. "You always did prefer direct confrontation over patience," Victor said, studying Damien with grudging respect even as his expression remained sharp with anger. "I underestimated how far you'd go for her." "You underestimated a lot of things," Damien said evenly, though his body remained tense, ready to protect Elena at any cost. "This ends now, Victor. Whatever you hope to gain through her, it's not going to happen." The tension between the two men stretched dangerously thin, each calculating the other's next move, until the sound of approaching sirens in the distance shifted the balance entirely. Someone had alerted local authorities to the disturbance, and Victor, unwilling to risk further complications, made the calculated decision to retreat rather than escalate the confrontation further. "This isn't finished," Victor said, stepping back into the shadows of the warehouse, his men following closely behind. "But not tonight." As Victor disappeared into the darkness, the tension in Damien's shoulders finally began to ease, though the adrenaline of the encounter left both him and Elena breathless. He turned to her immediately, checking once more for any injury, his usual composure completely abandoned in favor of raw, unguarded concern. "I thought I could keep you safe by staying away," Damien said quietly, his voice carrying a vulnerability Elena had never heard from him before. "I was wrong. Distance didn't protect you. It only left you unprotected when it mattered most." Elena reached out, gently resting her hand against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palm. "You came for me," she said softly. "That's what matters right now." Damien covered her hand with his own, holding it there as though anchoring himself to the moment, to her, to the realization that had finally become impossible to deny. "I tried to forget you," he admitted. "I told myself distance was strength, that walking away was the responsible choice, but every single time I failed. I couldn't stop thinking about you, couldn't stop wanting to protect you, couldn't stop caring about what happened to you. I don't think I ever really wanted to forget you at all." Elena looked up at him, exhaustion and relief, and something deeper mixing together in her expression. "Then maybe it's time to stop trying." As they made their way back toward safety, leaving the warehouse and its dangers behind them, Neither of them spoke of what would come next. But for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, both of them understood clearly that whatever the future held, they intended to face it together rather than apart. The days following the rescue passed in a strange blend of relief and lingering tension. Elena stayed at a secure location arranged by Damien's organization, a quiet house on the edge of the city, where she could finally begin to process everything that had happened without the constant fear of being watched. Damien visited every day, sometimes staying for hours, other times only long enough to make sure she was safe before returning to manage the fallout of Victor's failed plan. "You don't have to keep checking on me every few hours," Elena said one evening, watching him pace near the window of the small living room, his attention divided between her and the phone that never seemed to stop buzzing with updates from his people. "I know," Damien admitted, finally sitting down beside her, though his shoulders remained tense. "I just can't shake the feeling that if I look away for even a moment, something else will go wrong." Elena reached over, gently placing her hand over his. "You found me. You brought me back safely." Victor retreated. "For now, we're okay." "For now," Damien repeated, the words carrying a weight of uncertainty neither of them could ignore. Victor isn't the kind of man who accepts defeat easily. He'll regroup, and when he does, he'll come at this from a different angle. "Then we prepare for that," Elena said simply. "Together, this time, no more distance, no more pretending you can protect me by pushing me away." Damien studied her carefully, searching her expression for any sign of doubt, any hint that the danger she had just survived might have changed her mind about wanting to remain close to a world as dangerous as his. Instead, he found only quiet determination, the same strength that had first drawn his attention to her all those weeks ago in that alley. "You understand what staying close to me actually means," Damien said carefully. "This isn't a life free of danger. Even with every precaution, there will always be risks. People like Victor will always exist, always looking for ways to strike at whatever matters most to me." "I understand," Elena said. "I'm not naive about what I'd be choosing, but I've had time to think while I was in that room, wondering if I'd ever see you again. And the only thing I kept coming back to was how much I wanted the chance to choose you properly, without you deciding for me what I could or couldn't handle." Her words settled over Damien with a quiet weight, dismantling the last of his resistance to fully accepting what he had known for weeks, but refused to admit completely. He had spent his entire adult life building walls to protect the parts of himself he believed needed protecting, convinced that vulnerability was a weakness he couldn't afford in a world that punished hesitation. Elena had walked straight through every one of those walls without ever needing to force her way in. Over the following weeks, life slowly began to find a new, careful rhythm. Damien worked closely with Nathan to strengthen defenses across every aspect of his organization, aware that Victor's retreat was only temporary and that a more permanent resolution would eventually be necessary. Elena, meanwhile, returned cautiously to her flower shop, accompanied always by quiet, unobtrusive protection that Damien insisted upon despite her occasional protests about needing her independence. Grace noticed the changes immediately when Elena finally returned to their regular coffee meetings. "You seem different," she observed, studying her friend carefully. "Not just happier, steadier somehow." "A lot has happened," Elena admitted, though she still couldn't share the full truth of what she had experienced. "But I think I finally understand what I want, and who I want to build a life with, even if that life looks completely different than I ever imagined." Grace didn't press for details, sensing that whatever Elena had been through, it had changed her in ways that required time and trust to fully explain. Instead, she simply squeezed her friend's hand and offered the kind of quiet support that didn't require complete understanding. Meanwhile, Victor Marchetti had not abandoned his ambitions, despite the setback at the warehouse. He spent weeks reassessing his approach, understanding that a direct assault against someone under Damien's protection would only strengthen the resolve of both Damien and Elena, rather than weaken it. Patience once again became his chosen strategy, though this time tempered by a growing respect for an opponent who had proven far more resourceful than expected. Damien, aware that Victor's silence likely meant careful planning rather than genuine retreat, made the difficult decision to confront the threat directly, rather than wait indefinitely for another attack. Working alongside Nathan and a small group of trusted allies, he began quietly dismantling the resources Victor relied upon, cutting off supply lines, disrupting alliances, and systematically weakening the foundation of the Marchetti family's influence within the city. The confrontation that finally settled the conflict between the two families happened not through violence, but through a carefully executed negotiation that left Victor with no leverage remaining. Faced with the loss of nearly every advantage he had spent years building, Victor was forced to accept terms that ensured his family's retreat from any further conflict with the Voss organization. Terms that included leaving Elena and everyone connected to Damien permanently outside any future considerations of leverage or attack. When Damien finally returned to Elena's flower shop to share the news, he found her exactly where he had first truly seen her weeks earlier, surrounded by flowers, sunlight streaming through the windows, completely absorbed in the quiet work that had always brought her peace. "It's over," Damien said simply, watching her look up at him with cautious hope. "Victor has agreed to terms. You're safe now. Truly safe, not just for the moment." Relief washed over Elena's face, followed quickly by something softer, something that had been building steadily beneath the tension of the past weeks. "And you?" she asked. "Are you safe too?" "As safe as someone in my position can ever be," Damien admitted honestly. "But for the first time in years, I feel like I finally have something worth protecting that danger to fight for. That changes everything." Elena set down the flowers she had been arranging, crossing the shop to stand directly in front of him. "You spent so long trying to convince yourself you could forget me. That distance was the responsible choice. But every single time, you came back. Every single time, you failed to stay away." "I know," Damien said, reaching out to gently cup her face in his hands. "I don't think I ever really wanted to succeed at forgetting you. Some part of me knew from that very first night that you weren't someone I was ever going to be able to walk away from completely." "Then don't," Elena said softly. "Don't try anymore. Choose this. Choose me. Fully. Without holding back out of fear of what it might cost." Damien looked at her for a long moment, the weight of everything they had survived together, settling into something clearer than it had ever been before. He had spent his entire life believing that power meant control, that strength meant never allowing anyone close enough to become a vulnerability. Elena had taught him something entirely different, that real strength sometimes meant choosing to be vulnerable anyway, choosing connection despite the risks it carried. "I choose you," Damien said finally, the words carrying a certainty that replaced every doubt he had once held. "Not because it's safe, and not because it's easy, but because you're worth every risk this choice will ever bring." Elena smiled, the kind of smile that held both relief and quiet joy, and leaned into him as he wrapped his arms around her, the flower shop around them filled with the soft, steady peace neither of them had believed they would ever find in a world as dangerous as the one Damien had always known. In the months that followed, their life together settled into something neither extraordinary nor entirely ordinary, a careful balance between the demands of Damien's world and the quiet stability Elena had always valued. There were still challenges, still moments of tension when Damien's responsibilities pulled him away, or when new threats occasionally tested the peace they had fought so hard to secure. But through every difficulty, the foundation they had built together remained unshaken. Nathan, who had watched Damien's transformation from careful distance to complete devotion, often remarked that he had never seen his friend so genuinely content, despite the ongoing complexities of their world. "You used to say caring about someone was a weakness," Nathan reminded him one afternoon, watching Damien glance toward his phone with the same soft expression he now wore whenever Elena's name appeared on the screen. "I was wrong," Damien said simply. "It's not a weakness. It's the only thing that ever made any of this worth fighting for." Elena, for her part, never regretted the choice she had made, despite the dangers that occasionally shadowed the edges of their life together. She had learned that love, real and lasting, wasn't about avoiding risk entirely, but about choosing, again and again, to face whatever came alongside someone worth facing it with. Damien Voss had spent years believing he was untouchable, a man who controlled his world so completely that nothing could ever truly reach him. Elena Cross had proven otherwise, not by weakening him, but by giving him something worth being strong for. He had tried, more times than he could count, to forget her, convinced that walking away was the responsible choice, the safe choice, the choice that would protect them both. He had failed every single time, and in the end, that failure had become the greatest success of his entire life.